Thank you for inviting me to speak at today's event, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm speaking at another event at the same time. However, I will be available to join you later this afternoon for the Q&A session. I'm going to discuss lifting families out of poverty, what aspects matter. This presentation is discussed in 3 sections: what could or should be done, how it could or should be done, and when it could or should be done. In exploring what could or should be done, I will discuss which policies should stop with immediate effect and which should be implemented as soon as possible. One of the first aspects that matters to families living in poverty are those policies that are causing actual harm to families and which should stop immediately in order to reduce that harm. It will come as no surprise that the first policies that I would press the big red stop button on would be the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, and the impending removal of the £20 per week universal credit uplift, which will be experienced as a significant cut to many families. We also need to stop punishing the children living in families with no recourse to public funds. Not many people understand what is meant by no recourse to public funds. Indeed, recent politicians do not fully understand what is meant by no recourse to public funds. People also wrongfully assume that only illegal immigrants or asylum seekers and refugees have no recourse to public funds. And in fact, depending on a person's immigration status, they can have a valid work permit and live and work here for many years, but still have no recourse to public funds. Should they then lose that employment, such as might happen during a global pandemic, then they will have no recourse to public funds, except for those few funds that are contributory. Asylum seekers also have no recourse to public funds. However, refugees with their leave to remain do. Until this year, no recourse to public funds only affected people from out with the European Union and the European Economic Area. However, from this year, it can affect people from the EU and the EEA too. And this is a complicated area that continues to cause confusion and a lack of understanding in the general population. The big red button should also be pushed rather, to stop punishing parents under the age of 25. Under the legacy benefits system, parents under the age of 25 were treated financially the same as parents over the age of 25. For rent, bills, and the cost of living with a baby do not change according to your age. However, under universal credit, that has changed, and parents under the age of 25 receive less universal credit than those over the age of 25. The Child Poverty Action Group carried out research which found that paying young parents the adult rate of universal credit would lift 10,000 children out of poverty. A letter from the UK Minister for Welfare Delivery in response to a campaign by CPAG and others said, "The government considers that, where possible, it's in the best interests of children to be in working households. The lower rate for younger claimants who are under the age of 25 years reflects the fact that they are more likely to live in someone else's household and have lower earnings expectations. This is intended to maintain the incentive for younger people to find work." What's extraordinary in this statement is the fact that the Minister is linking benefits to earnings expectations. It assumes that being in a working household precludes experiencing poverty, and it shows that they have no idea how young parents actually live if they think that they are living in households with people looking after them. And we'll come on to discuss in-work poverty later. We need also to press the big red button on the persistent underfunding of and cuts to public services, especially those that relate to children and families, for example, mental health and family support services. We need to press the big red stop button on the debt, and in particular the public debt that people currently face. Public debt results in deductions taken from benefit payments at source for a range of reasons, including repayment of universal credit advances, legacy payment and benefit overpayments, budgeting loans, rent arrears, council tax arrears, utility bill arrears, and mortgage interest payments. In my recent research for the Trussell Trust, called The State of Hunger, 41% of disabled people and 47% of all people who needed to use a food bank were in debt to the Department of Work and Pensions. In fact, over 3 years of the research, the DWP had become the largest creditor to those who needed to use a food bank. In August 2020, 41% of all households on universal credit were subject to a deduction for a universal credit advance payment. For households that started claiming in the March to June period at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, that share was even higher at 63%. And those reductions are for universal credit advance payments alone. We need systems and processes that do not create a debt for people that keeps them in the tight grip of poverty. And to kickstart this, we need an immediate public debt amnesty. We need the universal credit advance payment to be made non-repayable. As the government says, the 5-week wait for a full claim cannot be changed. And in October, I'll be starting a new research project on public debt. We need to understand the financial impacts of having a disabled person, be it parent or child, in the household. We need to adequately reimburse families for the higher costs of living associated with disability. For those in receipt of carers allowance, we need to remove the financial cap on earnings that prevents carers from working and which keeps them in poverty. We need to stop the systems clashing with each other and not speaking to each other. For example, being a lone parent and undertaking educational qualifications leads to a clash between the benefit and the student system. And this is especially the case with regards to housing benefit. And speaking of housing, we need to press the big red stop button on the selling off of council houses. In Scotland, the right to buy your council house ended in 2016. We need to press the big red stop button on the more punitive aspects of conditionality and benefit sanctions. Prior to November 2008, lone parents with a youngest child up to the age of 16 could claim income support as a lone parent and not be affected by work-related conditionality. At the end of 2008, the age of the child had reduced to 12 years old. By 2011, the age of the child had reduced to 7 years old, and in 2012, it was reduced further to 5 years old. From April 2017, universal credit requirements meant that parents of preschool-aged children, aged 3 or 4, had to look for work or risk being sanctioned. And without an adequate, accessible, universal childcare provision, this condition is extremely difficult to meet and puts undue pressure on lone parents. We should reinstate the higher age of the child threshold before lone parents become subject to conditionality. And the list on the stop button is not exhaustive, but it does give a flavour of what we need to stop doing badly. And I'm sure you could come up with a few more of your own that we could press the big red stop button on. So, pressing the big green go button. At the same time as stopping those policies that are actively causing harm to children and families, we also need to press the green go button on other policy initiatives. We need to understand that poverty and wider inequalities go hand in hand, and that they have cumulative effects that are greater than the sum of their parts. We need to press the big green go button on viewing the impacts of policies through a lens of intersectionality that takes account of people's multiple characteristics, such as gender, race or ethnicity, disability, and nationality or migration status, as these have intrinsic connections to economic disadvantage. And these intersections matter, and they have real consequences in people's day-to-day lives. The importance of taking an intersectional approach to poverty is underscored by the COVID-19 crisis. As many observed, while we may be weathering the same storm, we were not all in the same boat. And left unchecked, the pandemic is expected to deepen existing inequalities. An intersectional approach is essential to understanding the lived experience of poverty and inequality and to inform better solutions to build back better or build back fairer. We need to understand that some families are more at risk of living in poverty than other families and prioritise these families. That means, as well as having universal policies and services, we need to target policies at those families at greatest risk of poverty. For example, families who are lone parents, larger families, ethnic minority families, families with a disability, families with a child under the age of 1, families with the mother under the age of 25, families where the parent has been in state care, and others not listed here. We need to press the big green go button on policies targeted at those families, policies that will increase these families' incomes and not punish them for their composition. We could consider assuring families of a minimum income guarantee through social security, employment, and free-to-use services. Such a minimum income guarantee is currently under discussion in Scotland. And a minimum income guarantee is different from a basic income because rather than a universal income payment payable to all, the minimum income guarantee is a floor below which no one is allowed to fall. As well as having an amnesty on public debt, there should be easy access to culturally sensitive money advice, income maximisation, and greater access to lower interest credit for low-income families. We need to press the big green go button on legislating for employers to pay the real living wage and not the below poverty level national minimum wage. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us that childcare is a fundamental part of the economic infrastructure of our country. Without it, access to employment and education is virtually impossible. We need to press the big green go button on a long-term plan to develop the childcare workforce infrastructure to create a universal full-time childcare provision. We need to understand that housing and paying outrageous housing costs, particularly in the private rental sector, is a factor holding people in poverty and adversely affects their life chances, health and well-being. We should press the big green go button on building more social housing and introducing rent caps for private sector rentals. As well as income-related policies, we should be looking at service-based policies. One example is that we should extend children's rights to access free school meals by widening the eligibility criteria. We should ensure that cash payments during school holidays to replace free school meal entitlement is in place for families, and we should ensure that it is a cash-first approach. These are issues that became very apparent during the schools lockdown in 2020. So how should we do all of these things? Well, in the first instance, the initial immediate way in which we could press the big red stop button or the big green go button on social policies to lift families out of poverty are for policymakers and ministries to work with each other in genuine co-production and collaboration. Policy areas still operate in silos. When legislating for housing, there is not so much focus given to how this could tackle poverty and inequality or health or climate change. When legislating for employment, we could give more thought to how this could impact on children's poverty. But legislators would say that children don't have jobs, do they? But 2/3 of children living in poverty live in a household where at least one adult works. So yes, employment policy is critical for child poverty. Similarly, education policy, and in particular further and higher education policy, do not think about how they interact with the benefit system, the housing system, or poverty more broadly. Yet many parents are or would like to be students. This is especially critical for younger parents and lone parents who are at increased risk of poverty and who tend to have lower levels of education than older parents or coupled parents. And they would like very much to access education and do so in greater numbers than their older coupled counterparts. And to be able to reach that holy grail of a secure, decent quality job that the government tells us is within all of our grasps, then a certain level of education is required. And if the government is serious about levelling up, and if the government is serious that employment is the best route out of poverty, then they have to understand that employment, first of all, has to pay a real living wage and that it is guided by factors such as where one lives, how one moves around, one's level of education, access to childcare, and one's experience of discrimination on the basis of personal and social characteristics. All of these factors act, react, and interact and ought not to be legislated for in isolation to each other. As well as reducing or eliminating siloed ways of working, having to create equality impact assessments that include socioeconomic inequality would help to create a framework around joined up working. This could easily be implemented by pressing the big green go button on the socioeconomic duty that was never implemented but is present in the Equality Act of 2010. Indeed, some councils, such as Newcastle Council, treat the socioeconomic duty as if it were in force. And Scotland has enacted the duty and called it the Fairer Scotland duty. The Fairer Scotland duty places a legal responsibility on particular public bodies in Scotland to actively consider or pay due regard to how they can reduce inequalities of outcome caused by socioeconomic disadvantage when making their strategic decisions. To develop a joined up way of thinking, working and policy environment, there is a need for central government to have greater engagement with local government, civil society, other sectors and members of society, including those who are experts by experience. The best policy solutions come from collaborative, iterative processes that stress test new policies prior to implementation. To build back better or build back fairer, or to assure economic and social renewal in a post-pandemic environment, we need to have social policy expertise at the economics table, and we need economists sitting at the social policy table. These two systems have long worked in silos, with the economic system considered critical and the social policy system considered a nice thing to have. When there's deemed to be pressure on resources, the social policies are the first to be constrained. And the pandemic has shown us that both social and economic policies are critical and that they are interdependent. They need a place at each other's table. To answer the question of when, then these policy suggestions do lend themselves well to short, medium, and long-term planning and implementation. In the short term, say 1 year or less, the big red stop button can be pressed on those punitive and harmful policies. This would arrest the incline in the rate of child poverty and create the conditions for its reduction. The policies on which to press the big green go button lend themselves well to medium-term planning of between 1 and 5 years, which is a parliamentary term which should appeal to politicians' political expediency. The bravest measures are those which will take longer than a parliamentary term to truly come into effect. These are the measures that create long-term change by providing the infrastructure to lift families out of poverty. One obvious example, as previously mentioned, is in developing a universal, high-quality, full-time childcare provision for all children and families. And this would involve developing and expanding the workforce, supporting and training the workforce to ensure the care is of a high standard, investing in buildings to host the childcare, and in transport to access childcare and employment opportunities, which would take time but would create the conditions for lifting many families out of poverty. This is just one such example, and there are many others. So to conclude then, in the short term, we may need to ask that social security, both the cessation of harmful policies and the introduction of new policies, does the heavy lifting in hoisting families out of poverty. In time, in the medium term, during a parliamentary term, you can legislate so that employment and the real living wage shoulder more of the heavy lifting. And in the longer term, we can greatly improve the infrastructure, such as childcare, public transport, and affordable housing, that will reduce the need for some of the shorter and medium-term measures. So in conclusion, no one policy initiative or even policy area can be adjusted to lift the maximal number of families out of poverty. Rather, it's going to take a multitude of policies working together in a system of levers and pulleys to provide the structural machinery to lift families out of poverty. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I will be here for the Q&A session this afternoon. And for those of you on social media, please do follow me on Twitter at Morag Treanor. Thank you very much for your attention.